Good morning, everyone. So today we're going to look at Material by Ros Barber. Presumably by now you should have read the poem and sort of had a think about some of those questions. So material then, obviously alluding to the material of the hanky, but it also sort of refers to the speaker's nostalgia. For a past time, for a less sort of consumer-driven world. Also, it considers the transition between sort of childhood and adulthood and sort of growing up. So the actual poem itself then, so my mother was the hanky queen. Hanky obviously being the colloquial term for handkerchief, suggests a sort of familiarity and gives sort of quite a friendly tone. Queen again suggests the importance of the speaker's mother. But also not only that, but of the importance of the memories that are associated with the handkerchief and her mother's time. When hanky meant a thing of cloth, not paper tissues bought in packs. So this comparison to kind of the present time shows how times have changed. So the paper tissues happen to be bought from late night garages and shops, so clearly not sort of pre-planned and pre-thought about like the handkerchief might have been. But it also indicates a time when like shops were open only at very specific times. You know, years ago you didn't have such a thing as 24-hour shops or, you know, open late garages. You know, it would be sort of 9 to 5 opening hours, and that was that. So it speaks to an older time. But things for waving out of trains and mopping the corners of your grief. So the handkerchief again takes on quite a romantic image here of, you know, people waving handkerchiefs out of trains to say their final farewells. It also talks about alludes to a time that is perhaps harking back to an era when women filled this sort of more traditional role at home. So we could talk about this sort of romanticised and for mopping the corners of your grief. Now, clearly, you know, we know that grief doesn't have corners, so therefore it's a metaphor. But the corners of your grief is perhaps indicative of the corners of your eyes where you might, you know, mop your tears from, indicating, you know, it sort of helped with these emotional times. So when hankies were material, she'd have one always up her sleeve. We could talk about here the effect of the embedded subordinate clause always. It kind of creates a pause in the line and maybe sort of hints at the idea that she is thinking back to an earlier time. So you can talk about the embedded subordinate clause. Okay, the second stanza then. So she says that these handkerchiefs were tucked in the wrist of every cardie. Again, we get this sort of colloquial contraction here, creating a sense of, familiarity. And a mum's embarrassment of lace. So again, this sort of metaphor that it is a mum's embarrassment of lace. You know, you can imagine being a young child and perhaps your mother pulling out a handkerchief, much to your embarrassment, that was shoved up the sleeve of her cardigan, and then spitting on it, as indicated later on, with spittled and scrubbed against my face to wipe a bit of dirt off of your nose. Also, we've got a reference here to the V for Viv, so suggesting that it was special. It wasn't just a piece of material, it wasn't just like a tissue, that it was actually embroidered, showing some sort of care and pride in the ownership of this, which is perhaps juxtaposed with the embarrassment from the child. And sometimes more than one fell out, as if she had a farm up there where dried up hankies fell in love and mated, raising little squares. So we've got like a hint of sort of humour here, but it's very silly humour, very childlike humour, which again sort of shows this sense of mystery as a child. Where do all these handkerchiefs come from? So we can say that it shows like a childhood example of imagination. And obviously by the use of like a simile. But also this sort of idea where the hankies might have fallen in love. It's this romanticised, sort of nostalgic, comforting, warming feeling that the whole poem, I think, conveys of an earlier age. All right, the third stanza then. So she bought her own. So she obviously being the speaker's mother. I never did. So you could talk about the medial caesura there, indicating that her and her mother are not the same, that they are very different. Hankies were presents from distant aunts in boxed sets with transparent covers and script initials spelling ponce. So again, we get this idea that they are special, or they were special to that generation. The fact that they were boxed with transparent covers, indicating that it's a gift to be proud of. But then again, we get this sort of sense of humour here from Barbara when she says ponce. Now, ponce, can mean two things. So, as an adjective, it can mean like an effeminate man. It could also mean, as an adjective, a man who lives on a prostitute's earnings. But equally, it can be used as a verb, and the verb obviously meaning that if you ponce something from somebody, you are obtaining something without actually paying for it. So you're like taking something. So again, we see this sort of humour here again, as alluded to in that sort of childhood memory of, the fact that these handkerchiefs might be making love and raising little squares. But here, so we kind of get this idea again. It talks about the naffest Christmas present gift you'd get. So we sense that this opinion is that of the narrators and not the mother. So the fact that she sees this, she is the same child, remember, that is embarrassed earlier on from when her mother had been getting out the handkerchief. So we sense that this is the speaker's opinion, not the mother's. She talks about how her brothers would also get these, but they got male ones, serious and grey and larger, like they had more snot. So again, we get this sort of sense of humour, playing on this idea of gender stereotypes. We get this listing here, so we've obviously got the colon, medial caesura, and then serious and grey and larger. So remember, syndetic listing when we've got the excess of unnecessary connectives. So it kind of makes out that, that men were considered at this time much better than women, and the repetition of sort of "and" here, it implies that and gives a greater sense of dramatic importance. Next stanza then, so she said it was hankies that closed department stores. Now clearly it wasn't, this is like an assertion. Yeah, remember that's where we say our opinion as if it is a fact. But what she means by that is that all of these items, including handkerchiefs, which she goes on to mention, so headscarves, girdles, knitting wool, trouser presses, all of these things are all outdated. And they signify a time period that is now no longer. So they signify a change in our society. She then talks about, you'd never find them today in malls. And it's interesting that she uses malls, which is an Americanism, and therefore makes us consider, how our culture, how our societies have become Americanized. If you think about this idea of supermarkets being brought to England rather than, individual butchers or fishmongers, which she talks about later. But this idea that everything's got bigger, everything's got better, and we've somehow lost our sense of identity maybe as, England or Britain. So hankies, she goes on to say, demanded irons and boiling to be purified. So as well as being like personification here, it shows, with the powerful verbs demanded and boiling, indicates, that they were quite powerful. And obviously she is essentially talking about a piece of material. But to her, it's symbolic and it means more than that. And it represents more than that. She talks about how that actually when these family stores died out because these obsolete items were no longer bought anymore. So as a result, these family-run stores had to close down. She talks about that the hankies shuttered the doors when those who used to buy them died. So there's this reference to death throughout, and it might be the death of a lost era. It might be the death of actually these people associated with this era. But nevertheless, fashion died out along with the people who bought these items. She says, and somehow with the hanky's loss, greengrocer George, with his dodgy foot, delivering veg from a comma van, is history. So greengrocer George suggests like a personal touch that we've kind of lost. The fact that she knows his name, and would we be able to tell our greengrocer's name at the moment? Would we even be able to name who our local greengrocer is? But it's the fact that she's, again, harking back to this lost era of like personal community. She alludes to his dodgy foot. So again, showing that she knows him. And that he used to deliver veg from a comma van. Now, a comma van, slightly different spelling here, but a comma van was a British manufacturer of commercial vehicles from 1905 to 1979. So we can talk about a British van manufacturer. To kind of show again that we've lost this British identity. We've lost the fact, we don't have British made, British run things anymore, that we've kind of digressed. Think about how our companies have spread and have diversified, and perhaps even into other countries. So again, this idea continues with the friendly butcher who'd slip an extra sausage in. So this idea that, again, he'd give personal favours because you knew him and you'd see him every week, and he'd be almost like a friend rather than a butcher. The fishmonger who'd marble slab of haddock smoked the colour of yolks and parcelled rows of local crab. So again, creating like a detailed description of the imagery and the sights that you might see inside one of these, establishments. So it sort of conjures a picture of a lost time. Okay, moving on to the second page then. So she talks about the fact that this fishmonger's was opposite the dancing school, which again just shows, that she's painting a picture of a whole community. And Mrs. White with her painted talons, which were maybe totally inappropriate for a dance teacher who's supposed to be involved in like a sporting activity, but nevertheless this sort of thing was seen as okay and fine back then. Taught us when you're smiling from a stumbling out of tune piano. So again, stumbling suggests that it's clumsy. Now, is it clumsily played by the dance teacher? Is slightly out of tune, but again harks back to an earlier age. That expression make do and mend that was sort of popular during the war. It's sort of that idea, isn't it? And you could say, ironically, even though Ros Barber perhaps didn't anticipate it, actually this poem resonates with us more now, considering what's going on in the world with the coronavirus and the fact that lots of local trades and local businesses are going under as a result. Then we get the repetition of step together, step together, step together point. So as well as creating like a musical rhythm to the lines, actually, we could say that this sort of literally sort of stepping together indicates a movement or a movement of time, which she is talking about. She talks about the annual talent show. There wasn't a show at the end of every term. There wasn't a show every Saturday, which perhaps there is now. But actually it was something you'd prepare for, something you'd work for. And every mother was fencing tears. Again, fencing suggests like she's fighting tears. It's true emotion, genuine emotion. And yet there we see this reoccurring image of the hanky again. So she'd whip out a hanky from her sleeve. So again, whip is almost onomatopoeic here, and also indicates the speed with which, she'd handily kind of have it up her sleeve, but the speed with which she'd literally whip it out. It's sort of maybe alluding to sort of a humorous moment again. So she'd whip a hanky from her sleeve and she'd smudge the rouge from the little dears. So again, rouge, a type of makeup, obviously traditionally put on the cheeks. Would we imagine in this circumstance, the young children that would be dancing would have been wearing costumes and had makeup put on them, but nevertheless, like they're there to kind of wipe off dirty marks, or perhaps they put a bit too much rouge on and the mothers are sorting it out. She then goes on in the next stanza. She says, nostalgia only makes me old. And nostalgia, one of the questions that I asked you to think about, and how is this poem nostalgic? It comes from the Greek meaning coming home. And so therefore, there is this sense of almost coming home, going back to childhood memories and feeling comforted by them. Remember, home, not a house. So home is, you've heard that expression, home is where the heart is. It's that sort of cliched, perhaps, idea, but nevertheless, quite true. So she said, this feeling of coming home, it only makes me old by recognising all the things I've lost. She said, the innocence I want my brood to cling on to like 10 bob notes. So brood, like a collection of birds, like a family of birds. Indicating that her brood are like little tiny birds in a nest that are dependent on the speaker for kind of providing and nourishing and in this case educating them into the ways of the world. But she says, I want them to cling on, but cling on suggests that actually, it's almost inevitable that this change is going to happen. Cling indicates a sort of desperation. And 10 bob notes were like 10 shilling notes in old currency. She said it was killed in TV's lassitude. So lassitude is like a noun. It means a state of physical or mental weariness. So like a stagnancy or stillness. And it kind of hints at this idea of like that we become almost couch potatoes, like this idea that we stay still a lot. But she's recognising this, but equally the irony with which she said, in order to write this poem, I had to turn on the television to kind of occupy her children. So it was her choice that she's done this, to buy some time to write this poem and eat bought biscuits I would bake if I'd commit to being home. Now, clearly, somebody like her mother who would commit to being home, again, maybe sort of hinting at earlier gender roles of women traditionally staying around the home. But she's pointing out her difference here. Hers are bought and not made. We get this plosive alliteration again here, don't we? So the b sound indicates like an unpleasant association because it's sort of a laboured sound. Okay, the penultimate stanza, she said, there's never a hanky up my sleeve. And, highlighting again her differences between her and her mother. I raised, she said, neglected looking kids, the kind whose noses strangers clean. People took pity on them because, they didn't look prim and proper and properly, looked after. But nevertheless, from what she's described, they're seemingly quite happy. So we can say others took pity. Again, if you think about this poem reminds me a lot of my own grandmother and looking at photographs of her when she was a child and looking at how, children were meant to be seen and not heard, and equally they were meant to look smart and, presentable at all times. Girls were meant to wear sort of very elaborate dresses and, even from sort of small baby age, totally impractical. But it's this idea that actually now, if our grandmothers, or in your case, maybe your great-grandmothers, were to look upon the way that you were raised, maybe they might have these same sort of feelings of pity that, their standards were somehow different from ours today. So we get this rhetorical question here. So what awkwardness in me forbids me to keep tissues in my bag when handy packs are just are 50p? And it shows her uncertainty, really. With the fact that, she knows she should probably keep them in her bag, but, what is it, she's asking, what is it that stops me? And this awkwardness, is it the fact that she, like her mother, completely owned that handkerchief? The handkerchief was not, her mother, but everything about that handkerchief is her mother for this person. And she's not accepted. There's not anything she can identify as particularly hers. She's not put her own stamp on anything else. So therefore she feels this sort of perhaps awkwardness. And also she doesn't want to succumb to being that woman, being that prepared mother, almost like her own mother. She doesn't want to turn into her mother in that sense. So she refuses to keep these handy packs, she says, in here. She says, I miss material handkerchiefs. Now, obviously, it's not the handkerchief she misses. This is representative of her mother, of her childhood, and all the other things that she's lost along with it. She says there's soft and hidden history. Again, soft, we can read in two ways. Soft handkerchiefs, the material is actually soft, but to me it seems quite a maternal softness. Again, maybe that of her mother, that she's unable to kind of get back. Last stanza then, she says, but it isn't mine, as in the handkerchief is not hers. I'll let it go. My mother too, eventually, who died not leaving handkerchiefs but tissues and uncertainty. So suggesting that, the speaker feels a sense of being lost. She has no purpose, no sense of direction. She doesn't know what the future holds for her. Again, maybe thinking that everything her mother had when she was a young woman was sort of really planned out for her, or she seemed to have a really good idea of what it was she was going to do for the rest of her life. Whereas now it's not uncommon to sort of be in your, even reach sort of middle age and still not be quite sure what it is that you want to do with your life. She says she would say, should I complain of the scratchy and disposable, that this is your material, to do with, daughter, what you will. So again, it's fitting that this is the last line, because this is almost the last message that the mother perhaps would have given her daughter. Now it's interesting structurally now that this stanza is the only stanza that has 9 lines as opposed to 8. And we need to think about why that is. Is it for added emphasis, that this is the last stanza in the poem? Could it be to do with the fact that this final message is an extra, is an added line, and therefore puts emphasis on her mother's message, or what her mother would think or say? But just a little bit more sort of generally on structure then. So we get obviously quite regular verses of 8 lines. There is no metre. If we look, it starts off in the beginning as sort of 8 syllables, and then sort of changes. So we can't say it's a definitive metre, but it definitely does have sort of a rhythmic quality to it. Most stanzas, with the exception, I think, of one, are end-stopped, which means there's a full stop at the end of the stanza, which kind of perhaps represents like moments in time. But this is teamed with lots of enjambment in the poem. So we get these sort of moments in time which are seamlessly flowing or on to the next moment without us even realising. So you could say that this mimics a period of transition, a change of time. And also she makes use of like the visual form. She relies on the fact that we will be looking at this as well as hearing it, because of course we get these moments of italics, like the final 2 lines when she says, this is your material, to do with, daughter, what you will. And also earlier on when she's alluding to the dancing teacher, teaching them when you're smiling. It kind of shows us it like a change in tone, adds further emphasis. A little bit like in Larkin's poem Poetry of Departures, is that the one? Yeah, no, I might be wrong. But one of his poems makes use of italics for this sort of same reason.